Frank Dillard dropped the folder on the council table like it was garbage. Photographs spilled out, aerial shots, close-ups of cracked siding, a patched roof, a garage with oil stains on the concrete. He pointed at each one without touching them, the way a man points at something he doesn't want on his fingers. "This," he said into the microphone, "is what we're dealing with. You've got these old black men holding onto properties they haven't been able to maintain in 20 years, and they wonder why nobody wants to invest in Mineral Ridge." A council member in a gray suit leaned forward, barely glancing at the photos. "How many times have we sent notices to this address?" he asked. "4, Dillard said. "He just ignores them. These people always do." Another council member, third from the left, hadn't looked up from her phone in 10 minutes, finally spoke. She didn't even bother lowering her voice. "At some point you have to ask yourself, is he actually unable to fix it? Or does he just not care? Because honestly, some of these old black guys in these neighborhoods, they've given up. And they want us to feel sorry about it." Somebody in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. Nobody corrected her. 3 rows back. Walter Hayes, 71 years old. Vietnam veteran, 43 years in that house, sat perfectly still. He let every word land. Then he stood up, spoke his piece, with a dignity that filled the entire room, and walked out to his truck, alone in the cold. 90 days to make $8,000 worth of repairs. $2,200 in savings. 3 weeks later, 6 bleeding bikers showed up on his doorstep in the middle of a blizzard. He had no idea the man holding his unconscious rider upright had just stepped off the Forbes 400 list. Walt opened the door anyway. And the next morning a helicopter landed on his street. "Stay with me. Drop your city and local time in the comments right now. And if these are the stories you're here for, subscribe because you do not want to miss where this goes." Walter Hayes had lived on Founders Lane for 43 years, and in that time, he had watched the street change the way a river changes slowly. At first, almost without notice, until one morning you step outside and realize the whole landscape has become something you barely recognize. He bought the house in 1978. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a narrow kitchen that Ruth said had good bones, and a garage wide enough for 2 cars if you shifted things around. He and Ruth had saved every single dollar of the down payment across 3 years of double shifts at the Mineral Ridge Auto Shop. The day the keys were handed to them, Ruth walked through every room and touched each wall, like she needed to confirm through her palms that it was real, that it was theirs. "We own this," she said, standing in the kitchen doorway, tears running quietly down her face. Walt pulled her into his side. "We own this," he said. "That was 43 years ago. Ruth was gone now. The house still stood." Walter Hayes was 71 years old. He stood just over 6 feet, though time had taken a fraction of that. His hair had gone entirely silver by 60, and his face carried the kind of lines that don't come simply from years, but from the weight of things carried inside them. Grief, service, love, loss. The accumulated cost of showing up for 4 decades in a world that didn't always show up back. But it was his hands that told the most complete story. Wide, flat palms. Thick knuckles cracked and healed so many times they'd built their own kind of armor. Grease embedded under every nail so deep that no amount of scrubbing ever fully cleared it. His neighbors had been calling them Walt's tools for as long as anyone could remember, because those hands had fixed more things on Founders Lane than the city of Mineral Ridge had managed in 4 decades of budget meetings and hollow promises. Walt had worked at the Mineral Ridge Auto Shop for 31 years. Started at 19 as a lube technician, retired at 50 as head mechanic. Over those years, he had learned to know an engine the way certain gifted people know music not just by sound, but by feeling, by the specific wrongness of a vibration no one else in the room had registered yet. After retirement, he converted his garage into a free neighborhood repair shop. No sign on the door. No business license. No invoices. Just an open bay from 8 in the morning until the light gave out. Cars, lawn mowers, washing machines, furnaces. Once a 16-year-old brought him a bicycle with a bent frame from a fall. Walt straightened it by hand on a Sunday afternoon, saying nothing, just working. When it was done, he handed it back and told the boy to be careful. That was the entire transaction. He never charged a single dollar. When people pressed cash into his hand, he waved it off like it mildly offended him. "Come back when something else breaks," he'd say. "That's the only payment I need." Carla Washington. His neighbor of 22 years once tried to document how many households Walt had helped in a single year. She filled 3 pages and gave up counting. Ruth Hayes died 6 years ago. Ovarian cancer stage 4 found late. Diagnosed in March and gone by November. 8 months from the first word to the last breath. Walt was there every single day of it. He slept in the hospital recliner beside her bed so often and so consistently that the night shift nurses learned his coffee order without asking black, no sugar, the bigger cup. When she passed, it was 4 in the morning. The ward quiet, her hand small and still inside both of his. He sat with her like that for a long time before he reached for the call button. He still tended her garden every spring without exception. Tomatoes against the south fence. Marigolds beside the porch steps. The climbing roses she had planted during their first summer in the house, which had grown over the decades into something extraordinary. People walking past on Founders Lane said Ruth's garden was the most alive thing on the entire street. Walt never responded when people said this. He just made sure it stayed true. There was something else about Walter Hayes that most of Founders Lane simply didn't know, because he had never once raised the subject in 43 years of living among them. He had served 2 tours in Vietnam. Infantry. He came home in 1974 to a country that didn't know what to do with men who looked like him and had seen what he'd seen, and he quietly set about building something real from whatever welcome he hadn't received. In the top drawer of his nightstand, wrapped in a square of folded cloth, was a purple heart. He hadn't looked at it in years. He kept it because Ruth had once told him to. He kept most things because Ruth had told him to. His monthly income now totaled $1,140 Social Security and a VA pension that had not been adjusted in 5 years. That was everything. Taxes, utilities, groceries, blood pressure, medication, and the slowly growing list of house repairs that had been waiting too long for attention. Which brought him inevitably back to the letter. Frank Dillard had been appearing on Founders Lane for 2 years, with his clipboard and his camera citing violations on properties that older, whiter neighborhoods never seemed to accumulate. His latest notice against Walt listed 14 items. Required repairs totaled $8,400. Walt had $2,200 in savings. He had read the letter twice at his kitchen table, under the one working overhead light, then folded it in half and slid it under his coffee mug. Then he walked back out to the garage and finished Carla's radiator. Some problems you don't solve by staring at them. But outside, past the bare trees at the end of Founders Lane, the sky was beginning to change. The light going thin and pale in a way that Walt recognized immediately. He had grown up in Ohio. He had spent 50 years reading its weather. This was going to be serious. By 3 in the afternoon on February 18th, Walt had already moved through the house twice. He filled every large pot with water and lined them on the counter in case the pipes froze. He carried 2 extra cans of kerosene up from the cellar and set them beside the space heater in the living room. He checked the generator in the basement. It started on the 3rd pull, which he considered acceptable. He went through his emergency kit, systematically, Flashlights, batteries, candles. The green metal first aid box he had assembled himself years ago from a military surplus catalog, filling each slot with the quiet seriousness of a man who understood what it costs to be unprepared. Before the daylight entirely left the sky, he walked to the front window and set Ruth's old oil lamp on the sill. Plain amber glass, a brass fitting, the kind of kerosene lamp that hadn't been necessary in a house with electricity since roughly 1960. Ruth had kept it for decoration. Walt had kept it because she had. Every winter, before a serious storm, he placed it there, placed it. He had never analyzed the habit. He simply did it. Then he settled into his recliner, pulled the wool blanket over his legs, and listened to the wind begin to build. 500 miles northeast, in a meeting hall outside Utica, New York, 6 men had been preparing since noon. They were the Eastern Ohio chapter of the Iron Brotherhood Motorcycle Club, and they made this particular ride every year without exception. The occasion was the anniversary of Edward Big Eddie Reeves, founder and first road captain of the Iron Brotherhood's original Dayton chapter, Korean War veteran, and the kind of man whose absence leaves a shape in the world you keep walking into by accident for years afterward. Big Eddie had died 2 winters ago, a stroke fast, no warning, the way certain strong men go. His son Dominic had continued the memorial ride each year since. The Brotherhood showed up. That was the entire point. Dominic Reeves was 52 years old. Built wide and solid, the kind of frame that suggested something load-bearing, something structural. Silver threaded through his beard and along his jaw. Hands that were large and certain, the kind that still remembered what real labor felt like, even after decades of boardrooms. He had a way of standing weight perfectly balanced, completely still, that made spaces adjust to his presence rather than the other way around. On this one weekend every year, there were no conference calls, no staff briefings, no black vehicles with tinted windows. Just leather, the open road, and the memory of the man who had taught him that character was the only currency that couldn't be inflated. The storm forecast had said snow after midnight. By the time the 6 riders crossed into Ohio on I-76, it was already coming down hard. Visibility dropped to a quarter mile, then to nothing measurable. The road surface transitioned from wet to glassy, without warning that specific black ice that forms when temperature falls faster than any forecast accounts for, invisible until it becomes the only thing that matters. At 7:42 in the evening, Dom's front tire caught a patch of black ice on a long, gradual curve. The Harley went sideways in an instant, 800 pounds of machine sliding across frozen asphalt. He went down hard, rolled twice, came up on one knee. His right collarbone registered something serious and sharp. He didn't know yet how badly it was fractured. He stood up and filed it away for later. Behind him, Danny Reyes, 22 years old, youngest rider. In the chapter, the one they all quietly kept an eye on, had been too close. His bike caught the guardrail on the right shoulder. The impact came directly into his left leg. A deep laceration from mid-thigh downward through the denim, through everything. He went down and did not stand up under his own power. 2 remaining bikes would not restart. Engines flooded by the cold. Batteries drained to nothing. Cell towers in this section of eastern Ohio had been compromised since 6 in the evening. No signal. The GPS on Dom's phone showed one town within reasonable distance, Mineral Ridge, 4.3 miles due south. Dom looked at his men one by one. He looked at Danny in the snow. He made the decision the way he had always made decisions, quickly, without sentimentality, with complete clarity about what the situation actually required. "We move," he said. "I carry Danny. Everyone else pushes what they can and keeps walking. Nobody sits down. Nobody stops moving. You stop, you lose fingers. You stop longer than that, you lose more." They buried 3 bikes under a highway snowdrift on the shoulder and covered them with a tarp. They pushed 2. They started south into the dark. 5 men in leather jackets and motorcycle boots walking into a headwind with a wind chill of 28 degrees below zero, one of them carrying another across his back. The leather cut the wind the way a screen door cuts rain. Within the first 20 minutes, Hector's speech had slowed. His hands had stopped functioning properly at the fingers. Dom kept Danny's weight distributed across both shoulders and counted heads every 100 yards. Nobody sits down. They knocked on the first door they reached at the edge of Mineral Ridge. Nothing. The second house, a curtain shifted, then was pressed flat and still. The third, a porch light flickered on, paused, and went back off before anyone appeared. Danny's weight was pulling hard on Dom's cracked collarbone now. He adjusted his grip and kept moving. And then, at the very far end of Founder's Lane, in a single front window, a small amber glow. An oil lamp, steady and warm, burning in the dark like something that had been left there specifically to be found. Dom shifted Danny's weight onto his better shoulder, set his jaw, and walked toward it. The knock came at 9:23. 3 heavy impacts against the front door, the kind with real weight behind them. Walt had been sitting in his recliner under the wool blanket, not quite asleep, listening to the wind work on the house frame. The sound brought him straight upright. He sat still for one moment. Then he reached for the flashlight on the side table, clicked it on, and stood. Walt Hayes was not a man who frightened easily, and that was not something he said to impress anyone. It was simply a fact assembled from experience. He had been 19 years old in a rice paddy outside Da Nang when the man 6 feet to his left had his last conversation. He had come home to a country that offered him nothing recognizable as a welcome, and he had built something real from that silence anyway. He had sat beside Ruth through 8 months of her dying, and had not once looked away. A knock on the door in a blizzard was not the most frightening thing that had ever asked for his attention. He walked to the front door, flashlight in hand, and opened it. The 5 men on his porch seemed to take up more space than 5 men should. They were large, and soaked through their black leather jackets, long past offering any real protection against cold like this. Snow was packed into every surface, their shoulders, their beards, the patches on their vests, the creases of their boots. They brought with them the smell of frozen road and wet leather, and something underneath both of those, the raw, particular smell of men who have been running their bodies past what bodies are built for. One of them was being held upright between 2 others. Young, early 20s, his left leg wrapped in what appeared to be a jacket tied at both ends, the fabric dark and wet and entirely wrong in the flashlight beam. The man at the front spoke. He was the largest of the group, broad, silver-bearded hands, like load-bearing components. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than Walt expected from someone built like that. Stripped entirely down. No performance in it. Just the bare architecture of a man who needed something and was asking directly. "Sir, I am sorry to knock on your door at this hour. We went down on the highway. My youngest rider is hurt seriously. We need to get him inside and out of the cold." Walt moved the flashlight beam slowly across the group. 5 faces. 5 different stages of cold damage. The young man being held between the others, Danny was pale in a way that had nothing to do with his complexion. His eyes were tracking at half speed. His lips carried a faint blue tint that Walt had last seen in a field hospital a very long time ago and had never managed to fully forget. He brought the flashlight back to the man who had spoken, and he looked at his eyes, not threatening, not aggressive, not the eyes of someone playing a role for an audience. These were the eyes of a man who had been physically holding 4 other people together through something serious for several hours, and who was beneath all the leather and the quiet command simply and completely exhausted. Walt stepped back and opened the door wider. "Bring him in," he said. "Put him on the kitchen table." He didn't say anything else. He turned and walked to the kitchen, cleared the table in 4 seconds flat, and was already moving toward the basement stairs before the men had fully entered through the door. The first aid kit was on the second shelf, a green metal box with a handle assembled by Walt over 2 years from a military surplus catalog built with the systematic thoroughness of a man who had learned at 19, in a specific and permanent way, what happens when you are not prepared. He carried it up the stairs, set it beside Danny's leg on the table, and opened it. He worked the way he always worked in sequence, without waste, without the need to narrate what he was doing. He cut the makeshift wrap away with kitchen scissors. He assessed deep laceration mid-thigh to knee through the denim, and everything beneath it still bleeding, no arterial involvement that he could identify. He cleaned it with antiseptic, packed it with gauze, applied compression with the steady, deliberate pressure of someone who understood the difference between doing something and doing it correctly. Danny hissed once through his teeth. "Hold still," Walt said. Not unkindly, simply clearly. He worked the splint into position and bound it with the precision of a man securing something he expected to stay secured. Then he straightened up and looked at what he'd done. "That holds through the night," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone. "He needs a real surgeon, but not tonight." He turned to the rest of the room. 4 men had filled his living room completely. One of them, Hector, was standing against the far wall, and something about his posture was wrong in a way that was immediately recognizable. Slow blinks, jaw barely moving, skin the color of old concrete. "Get every wet layer off him," Walt said. "Right now. All of it." He went to the hall closet and pulled down every blanket he owned, 2 quilts, a wool blanket, an old comforter that had belonged to Ruth's mother. He wrapped them around Hector 1 layer at a time, steady, methodical speaking, in a low, continuous voice, as he worked not to Hector specifically, just talking, keeping the sound of a human voice present, which Walt understood. From a specific kind of experience was sometimes the thing that kept a person tethered when the cold had taken too much. Then he ran the extension cord from the generator outlet in the hallway to the space heater in the corner, clicked it on, and turned it to full. The room began slowly and unmistakably to change. Dom stood near the kitchen doorway and watched. He had spent 30 years building a company, and in that process had developed the ability to recognize one quality in a person above almost everything else, the quality of someone who solves problems without needing anyone to observe them do it. He watched the old man move through his living room, like a man who had always known exactly what to do in the dark. It was later, much later, that Dom noticed something on his own vest, where it hung drying over the back of a chair. The small patch below the club insignia, the bridge inside the circle. Walt had glanced at it once briefly while hanging the vest up. Dom had caught that glance register and then move on, filed away unfinished. He didn't think much of it in the moment. He should have. The generator hummed steadily in the basement, and the space heater in the corner pushed warm air in slow, deliberate waves across the living room floor. By 10 o'clock, the worst of the immediate danger had passed. Hector's color was returning slowly, imperfectly, but returning. Danny's leg was splinted and elevated on 2 couch cushions. The men had peeled off their soaked outer layers and draped them wherever there was space over chairbacks across the windowsill, folded over the radiator that hadn't worked in 2 winters. Walt went to the kitchen. He had a pot of chili in the refrigerator from 2 days ago, enough for maybe 3 portions. 4 if stretched carefully. He set it on the gas burner, opened 2 cans of kidney beans from the pantry shelf, added half a cup of rice, and a full can of diced tomatoes. He stirred it together without measuring anything, adjusting entirely by instinct the way a man does who has been feeding people for 50 years. While it heated, he lined up 5 bowls on the counter. He did not put out a 6th. Dom came to the kitchen doorway while Walt was ladling. He watched the bowls fill one by one. He watched Walt set each one on the counter, then reach for the serving spoon again for the next. 5 bowls. Walt turned off the burner. "You're not eating," Dom said. "Had a big lunch," Walt said. He didn't look up. He carried the bowls to the living room, 2 at a time. Dom stood in the doorway and watched him go. He didn't push it. But he noticed, and the noticing settled somewhere it wouldn't leave. The men ate without speaking for the first few minutes, the concentrated silence of people whose bodies have overridden everything else and are simply taking in fuel. Then gradually, the room loosened. Someone exhaled. Someone shifted their weight. Danny propped against the couch with his splinted leg stretched out in front of him, finished his bowl, and asked quietly if there was more. Walt brought him the last of the pot without comment. Ruth's quilt, blue and cream, hand-stitched 40 years of use, softened into something that felt like being held, was folded on the arm of the recliner. Walt picked it up and laid it across Danny without ceremony. "My wife made that," he said. "Try not to bleed on it." Danny looked at the quilt, then up at Walt. "Yes, sir," he said. His voice had changed from earlier. Something in it had opened. Hector, still wrapped in 3 layers of blanket in the corner chair, held up his phone at one point and turned the screen toward Walt. A photograph, a little girl, maybe 4 years old, dark eyes, gap-toothed grin, holding up a finger painting like she was presenting evidence in court. "My daughter," Hector said. His voice had come back almost fully now. Walt looked at the photograph for a long moment. "She's got your eyes," he said. Hector smiled. It was the first genuine smile in the room in hours. It was Dom who brought up Big Eddie. He hadn't planned to. It wasn't the kind of thing he typically offered to strangers, even strangers who had just saved his group from a serious situation. But something about the room, the lamp on the windowsill, and the old man who hadn't hesitated once, loosened something in him that was usually kept in place. "We were riding for my father," Dom said. "He passed 2 winters ago. Every year we make the same route he used to ride." Walt was sitting in his recliner, the wool blanket across his knees. He didn't respond immediately. He listened in the way that certain people listen completely, without preparing what they'll say next. "He was a fixer," Dom continued. "That was his thing, his whole thing. Didn't matter what it was, engine fence argument between neighbors, a kid going sideways. He'd find what was broken and he'd fix it. He used to say that was the only job worth doing." Walt was quiet for a moment. "Those are the ones who hold the world together," he said. His voice was even and unhurried, the voice of someone stating a fact he had known for a long time. "Nobody sees them while they're doing it. You only realize it when they're gone." Dom looked at him. Neither of them spoke again, but the silence between them was different after that. Quieter, somehow. The kind of quiet that means something has been understood. By 1 in the morning, all 5 men were asleep. Danny on the couch. Hector still in the corner chair, wrapped in his blankets. The others stretched across every cushion and folded piece of fabric Walt had been able to produce. 5 men in a living room built for one old man, and his memories filling every inch of available space, breathing slow and even and alive. Walt did not sleep. He sat in his recliner with the wool blanket over his legs and kept the kind of watch that veterans keep. Not tense, not anxious, simply present. One eye on the heater, one ear on the generator. He had kept watch in worse places than his own living room. He knew how to do this. After midnight, he reached into his wallet and pulled out a photograph. Deshawn's 16 school picture from last fall collared shirt. The faint beginning of something on his upper lip, attempting to look serious and almost managing it. Walt looked at the photo for a long moment. Then he put it back, stood carefully so as not to wake anyone, and went to the kitchen. He took Ruth's cast iron skillet down from its hook. He measured flour from memory-added buttermilk, a pinch of salt, A spoonful of sugar, the small exact amounts she had taught him in this same kitchen 30 years ago. He put the skillet on the gas burner at low heat and set the timer. He was still at the counter when he heard a shift behind him. Dom had woken. He stood in the kitchen doorway, looking at the old man working by lamplight at the skillet on the burner, at the absolute stillness of the scene. He didn't say anything. Walt didn't turn around. After a long moment, Dom went back to the floor and closed his eyes. The storm broke sometime before 5 in the morning, and Walt knew it not by sight, but by sound. The constant pressure of wind against the house frame, that low structural groaning that old houses make when serious weather leans against them, simply stopped. The whole building went quiet at once, as if it had been holding its breath for hours and had finally been allowed to release it. Walt sat with that quiet for a while. Then he went to the kitchen. His steel percolator, bought in 1993 and refused replacement on the grounds that it still functioned correctly, took 7 minutes from cold start to finished coffee. Walt had those 7 minutes memorized. While it ran, he put Ruth's cast-iron skillet on the burner, sliced the leftover cornbread into portions, and laid them cut side down to reheat. He set the remaining chili on low heat. Then he went to the front door and opened it. 2 feet of snow on the porch. Founders Lane buried completely, one unbroken white surface from one end to the other, glowing soft blue in the gray pre-dawn light. The temperature was still well below freezing, but the killing edge of the night before was gone. The air held that particular stillness that follows a serious storm. The world briefly catching its breath. Walt stood there for a moment. Then he went back inside and finished making breakfast. The men woke in ones and twos across the next half hour, stiff and blinking, and slowly remembering where they were and how they'd gotten there. Danny came around last. His color was back. Not entirely, but enough. Enough was the standard Walt applied to most things. The leg needed a surgeon. It needed that soon. But it had made it through the night, which an hour into that night had not seemed like a guaranteed outcome. They crowded around Walt's kitchen table, elbows touching walls, knees pressed against table legs, shoulders overlapping at every corner. 5 large men arranged around a surface built for 2. One of them pointed this out, and then they were all laughing, sudden and slightly surprised, the laughter of bodies remembering they're still here to laugh. They ate cornbread reheated in the skillet, and leftover chili, and drank coffee from Walt's collection of mismatched mugs. Nobody spoke much. The food said everything that needed saying. Danny ate slowly, and with concentration, like a man paying deliberate attention to the fact that he was still present to eat anything at all. Hector wrapped both hands around his mug and simply held it for a full minute before drinking, just feeling the heat move through his palms. When they finished, Dom reached into his vest, dry now from the night hanging near the heater, and counted $100 bills onto the kitchen table. He set them in a neat, flat stack directly in front of Walt. "For everything you did last night," he said. "Please take it." Walt looked at the money. He looked at it for exactly 2 seconds. Then he placed 2 fingers flat on top of the stack and slid it back across the table without picking it up. "I didn't open that door for money," he said. His voice was level. No heat in it. Simply clear in the way that certain things are clear when there is no uncertainty behind them. "Don't insult the night by putting a price on it." The kitchen went completely still. Dom stared at him. Something moved across his face, a shifting and opening, the particular expression of a man who has sat across from a great many people in a great many rooms and has just encountered something he was genuinely not prepared for. He nodded once. Slowly. Then he reached into his inside jacket pocket and produced a slim black leather folio, the kind of object that belonged in a boardroom rather than on a highway shoulder. He uncapped a pen. "Your full name and address," he said. "I want to send a proper thank you when I get back." Walt gave it without hesitation, didn't think twice about it. Before they left, the men moved through the property with the wordless efficiency of people who had worked together long enough to distribute a task without discussing it. Two of them attacked the buried driveway and porch steps, with the snow shovel they found leaning against the garage wall. Hector, moving carefully on recovering legs, noticed the broken latch on the cellar door in passing and repaired it with a multi-tool from his jacket pocket. 10 minutes of quiet, focused work. Nobody asked him. He simply did it. Dom found the woodpile buried under 2 feet of packed snow at the side of the house, dug it out completely, and restacked it under the porch overhang where the roof would protect it from the next storm. It was while Dom was finishing the woodpile that he stepped back through the kitchen door for his vest, and his eye caught something on the kitchen table. A folded piece of paper, half covered by Walt's coffee mug. He didn't read it. But the return address was visible on the exposed edge, printed in the standard municipal font he had seen on letterhead across 9 states. Mineral Ridge Office of Housing Compliance. His jaw set barely visible just for a moment. He said nothing. Danny was the last one out. He stopped in the threshold, turned back, and took Walt's hand in both of his. The bandaged leg wrapped in Walt's careful splinting was visible below his jacket hem. His voice when it came was not fully steady. "You saved my life, sir." Walt looked at him. "No," he said quietly. "You walked to the right door. That's all." Danny nodded. He couldn't say anything else. He turned and walked out. Walt stood on his front porch and watched all 5 of them make their way down Founders Lane through the snow until the road curved at the far end and they disappeared from sight. Then he went back inside, sat down at the kitchen table. His coffee mug was still there. He picked it up. The folded compliance letter was underneath it. He looked at it for a moment, put the mug back on top. 87 days. He finished his coffee. 10 days after the blizzard life on Founders Lane resumed its ordinary shape, which was to say that not very much happened, and most of it looked exactly like the day before. Walt fixed a neighbor's snow blower on a Monday. He shoveled Carla's walk on a Tuesday because her back had been giving her trouble since October. He paid his electric bill at the counter of the utility office on a Thursday because he didn't trust the mail. He called Deshaun on Sunday, as he always did, and told him about the bikers. The boy went quiet after Walt finished. "Were you scared?" Deshaun asked. Walt thought about it honestly. "No," he said. 5 big bikers knock on your door in a blizzard and you weren't scared." "They were just cold," Walt said. "Cold people aren't scary. They're just cold." Deshaun went quiet again, in the way he went quiet when he was working something out that he didn't have words for yet. Walt let him have the silence. "Granddad," he said finally. "Yeah. You're something else." Walt didn't respond to that. He asked about school and moved the conversation forward. The first strange thing happened 11 days after the storm. A truck from Harmon Building. Supply the lumber yard on the county road 2 miles east of Mineral Ridge pulled up in front of Walt's house at 9:30 in the morning. 2 men unloaded from it roofing timber, rolled insulation bats, copper pipe, in 3 different diameters, a box of electrical components, and 2 bundles of weatherproofing material. The total value on this delivery receipt was $4,200. The driver had Walt sign and drove away before Walt could fully form his question. He stood on the driveway and looked at the pile. Then he went inside and called Harmon Building Supply. The woman who answered confirmed the order, confirmed his delivery address. When he asked who had placed it, she checked her screen and told him the purchaser had requested to remain anonymous. Paid in full. Credit card over the phone. Walt hung up, went to the kitchen window, looked at the materials on his driveway. He left them there. The second strange thing happened 4 days later. A licensed contractor knocked at 8 in the morning professional van company logo on his shirt clipboard, the full presentation. He explained that he had been engaged by an organization called the Reeves Infrastructure Foundation to conduct structural repair work at this address, pursuant to an existing contract. Walt looked at him steadily. "Reeves who?" he said. The contractor showed him the work order. Walt read it carefully, then read it again. The foundation name meant nothing to him. The scope of work listed covered 11 of the 14 violations from his compliance notice line by line. He stood in the doorway holding the document. "What does this cost me?" he asked. "Nothing, sir. The foundation covers everything." Walt stepped aside and let them begin. That evening he walked to Carla's back door and knocked. Carla Washington kept her laptop on the kitchen counter and had a facility with Google that Walt had come to rely on in the absence of his own internet connection. He gave her the name. She typed it, read the screen. And something happened to her face that Walt had never seen on it before. The color left it. Simply drained away. "Walter," she said. "What?" She turned the laptop around and set it in front of him. A financial news article, a corporate profile, photographs. Walt leaned in and read the first 2 paragraphs, then looked at the photograph at the top of the article. Broad shoulders, silver beard. The specific quality of absolute stillness in the way the man held himself in the frame. Walt recognized the eyes before anything else. "This is a $3 billion company," Carla said. Her voice had dropped to just above a whisper. "He builds highways, Walt. He builds bridges across 3 states. He has 4,000 employees." Walt said nothing. He kept looking at the photograph. "That man," he said finally very quietly, "was sitting in my kitchen." Carla stared at him with her mouth slightly open. The next morning, Frank Dillard showed up. He came down Founders Lane in his city vehicle at 8:15, saw the contractor's van in Walt's driveway, and 2 workers already on the roof, and parked with his clipboard out before he'd fully stopped moving. He walked up the driveway with the specific energy of a man who has identified something within the boundaries of his authority and intends to apply that authority to its fullest extent. "Who authorized this work?" he called up to the workers. "I have not issued permits for this address. All work stops immediately until I conduct a full review of—" The lead contractor reached into a file folder on the seat of the van and handed him a document. Printed on letterhead. 3 full pages. Dillard took it and read. His expression moved through 4 or 5 distinct changes in rapid succession, none of them settling into anything that looked like confidence. He folded the document carefully, handed it back. He returned to his vehicle without saying another word and drove off Founders Lane. The workers watched him go. The lead contractor turned back to his crew. "Keep going," he said simply. That night, Walt was searching for a socket set in the back of his hall closet and found instead a trade magazine from 2019. He had forgotten he owned, picked up in a waiting room somewhere, carried home, shelved, and ignored. He sat down at the kitchen table and flipped to the back cover. A full-page advertisement. Clean design. A bridge rendered in precise, thin lines. The company name, Reeves Infrastructure Group, and below the bridge illustration, the corporate logo, a bridge inside a circle. Walt set the magazine flat on the table. He thought about the small patch below the club insignia on the vest he had hung over his kitchen chair 11 days ago. The shape he hadn't been able to place. He placed it now. He sat without moving for a long time, the magazine open in front of him, the space heater humming in the corner. The only sound in the house. He was still at the table when his phone rang at 6 the next morning. Carla. Her voice was completely unlike her normal voice. "Walt," she said, "there's something in the sky over Founders Lane. You need to come outside. Right now. Walt was still holding his phone when he pushed open the front door. The sound reached him before the sight did a low, heavy thrum that had no place in the usual sounds of Founders Lane at 6 in the morning. Not a vehicle. Not an aircraft passing at altitude. Something lower, something descending, something getting closer with every second. He stepped onto the porch. At the far end of Founders Lane, above the vacant lot, where the old McCready warehouse had stood before it burned in 2009. A helicopter was coming down. Dark blue corporate markings along the fuselage, the kind of aircraft that belonged over a city helipad or a major construction site. It descended with complete control, the pilot executing the landing with the unhurried precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times. The snow on the lot lifted in a wide, white ring as the skids settled and held. The rotor began winding down. Doors up and down Founders Lane were already opening. Carla was on her back steps with both hands pressed over her mouth. The woman across the street had come out in her housecoat and stood on her porch without speaking. A teenager on a bicycle at the corner put one foot down on the pavement and simply stared. A helicopter on Founders Lane meant something. Nobody on the street could immediately decide what. The aircraft door opened. A man stepped down onto the snow. Charcoal wool overcoat, single-breasted, tailored correctly across broad shoulders. Dark trousers. Polished shoes that had no business being in 2 feet of Ohio snow, and wore that fact without apology. Silver hair cut close. He carried nothing except a slim folder held at his side, and he crossed the lot toward the lane with the unhurried certainty of a man who has always known exactly where he was going, and stopped needing to demonstrate it to anyone long ago. Walt watched him come. He recognized the walk first. Then the width of the shoulders. Then, as the man stepped onto Founders Lane and moved toward his house, the face resolved in the morning light. And then, the eyes. Walt stood at the top of his porch steps and did not move. "Well," he said very quietly, "I'll be damned." The man came up the steps, the same steps he had climbed 11 days ago, on failing legs caked in ice, with another man's weight across both shoulders. He stopped at the top and looked at Walt directly. "Mr. Hayes," he said, "my name is Dominic Reeves. I apologize for not introducing myself properly when I was last here." Walt let the name land. He had read it on Carla's laptop screen 2 nights ago. He had seen it at the top of a corporate profile describing a company with 4,600 employees, infrastructure contracts spanning 9 states, and annual revenue of $2.4 billion. He had also seen it printed on the work order currently directing a crew to replace his roof. "Come in," Walt said. They sat at the kitchen table. The same 2 chairs, though one of them was wearing considerably different clothing than the last visit. Walt poured coffee without asking. Dom set his folder on the table between them, but did not open it yet. "The patch on your vest," Walt said. "The small one. Bridge inside a circle. Foundation donor identification," Dom said. "We tag our major grant recipients and partners. I've worn it on this ride for 3 years. You're the first person who ever noticed it." "I didn't ask about it," Walt said. "I just noticed." Dom nodded. He looked around the kitchen at the new window glass the contractors had installed at the space heater, still working in the corner. At the coffee mug sitting on the table covering the edge of a folded document he recognized. "My father was a Korean War veteran," Dom said. "Edward Reeves. He came home in 1953 to a country that had no particular interest in him. Nobody at the airport. Nobody asking what he had seen or what it had cost. He found work. He built something." He paused. "He did it on a street that looked a great deal like this one." Walt held his mug in both hands. He said nothing. He was listening in the way certain people listen completely, with no part of his attention held back. He used to say the only thing worth building was something that helped people stand up. Dom continued. "Not stand out, stand up. He looked directly across the table. "I watched you work in your living room for 6 hours the night of that storm, Mr. Hayes. You didn't ask our names. You didn't ask us anything. You just walked to the basement and started solving problems." When Walt was quiet for a moment. "Your father sounds like he was a good man," he said. "He was the finest man I ever knew," Dom said. "There was no performance in it, just the flat fact of it. He would have sat in this kitchen and felt entirely at home." Something moved through Walt's eyes, brief, private reel. He looked down at his mug, then back up. "I think he would have," Walt said. They sat with that for a moment. The space heater hummed. Outside, Carla was still on her steps. Half the street was watching the house from various positions of pretended casualness. Dom put his hand on the folder. "I want to talk through some things with you," he said. "I need you to hear all of it before you say a single word. Can you give me that?" Walt looked at him across the table. Set his mug down. "Go ahead," he said. Dom opened the folder with the care of a man who understood that information lands differently depending on the order it arrives in. One page at a time, set flat on the table, turned so Walt could read it right side up. He spoke, while Walt read, not rushing, letting each thing settle before moving to the next. "First," he said, "this house." The page showed a complete property assessment, every violation on the compliance notice itemized, plus several additional items Dom's team had identified independently. New roof, full tear-off and replacement. Foundation repointing along the north and east walls. Updated electrical panel current code. Full plumbing overhaul, 2 sections. And at the bottom of the list, a line that read, HVAC system. Full installation, properly sized unit, correct load, calculation for structure. A real furnace, not a space heater in a corner. Walt read down the list without speaking. "The garage," Dom said, before Walt could form a word. He had promised to stop Walt from speaking, and he intended to keep that promise. "I walked through it the morning we left. I want you to hear this clearly. We are not touching the garage. Not one wall, not one shelf, not one thing you built in there. We build around it. The garage stays exactly as it is." Walt looked up from the page. Something shifted in his face, small, almost nothing. The kind of thing that only shows in a face that has spent a lifetime keeping itself composed. "Second." Dom placed the next page. Walt read the header. "The Walter and Ruth Hayes Auto and Trade Workshop." Dom spoke while Walt read. The vacant warehouse at the intersection of Founders Lane and Mill Street, sitting empty for 3 years, collecting weather damage and graffiti, would be acquired by the Reeves Infrastructure Foundation and fully converted. Professional-grade equipment throughout. Auto mechanics, basic electrical plumbing fundamentals. Open 5 days a week, free of charge, to any Mineral Ridge resident. "Head instructor," Dom said. "Paid director position. Full salary and benefits. We staff 4 supporting positions from this neighborhood, all local hires, all paid. The foundation covers full operating costs for the first 3 years, then transitions to a sustainable model with municipal and private partnerships." He paused. "Because you fix things, Mr. Hayes. That is who you are. I watched you do it all night in a blizzard. And I believe there are people on this street who need someone to show them how." Walt's hands were flat on the table. He read the page twice. Dom placed the 3rd page. Founders Lane Community Development Grant, $750,000. Full sidewalk replacement along both sides of the lane. 6 new streetlights installed along the dark south end. A playground constructed on the vacant lot at the lane's end, the lot currently occupied by a helicopter. And a Veterans Memorial wall granite installed at the corner of Founders Lane and Mill Street, bearing the engraved names of Mineral Ridge residents who had served in uniform. "Managed by a community board," Dom said. "Local residents making local decisions. I would like you to chair it." Walt looked at the grant total. He looked at the line about the memorial wall. He read it again. Dom placed the 4th page. Walt read the header. Read it a second time. The Walter and Ruth Hayes Scholarship. 2 annual awards of $20,000 each granted to graduating seniors at Mineral Ridge High School who demonstrated meaningful service to their community. Permanent endowment. Funded in perpetuity. Ruth's name. In print. Permanent and clean on the page in front of him. The kitchen was completely silent. Walt sat perfectly still. 11 seconds passed. Then his jaw moved, once tightening, releasing. He reached up slowly and pressed the back of his hand against his mouth and held it there. His eyes did not close. He looked at the page. Dom said nothing. He sat and gave the silence exactly what it required. Walt lowered his hand. He exhaled once, steadily, the long, controlled breath of a man who has spent a lifetime not falling apart in front of other people, and is not going to start now. Then Dom reached inside his coat and placed a second document on the table, this one folded separately. He slid it across. Walt recognized the Mineral Ridge Housing Compliance letterhead immediately. But across the face of it, in Dom's own handwriting, resolved Reeves Infrastructure Foundation. Below that, in typed text, formal complaint re-documented pattern of selective code enforcement filed with the Ohio Housing Regulatory Board. Supervisory review of Inspector F. Dillard initiated. Monday. Walt stared at the document for a long moment. "You can't buy a man's dignity," he said. "Low steady, entirely certain. But you sure as hell can give it back." "Yes, sir," Dom said quietly. "That's exactly right." A long silence passed between them, the comfortable kind. Walt looked at the scholarship page one final time. "Can I put Ruth's name on the workshop itself?" he said. "Not only on the scholarship, on the building." Dom didn't hesitate for even a moment. "I was going to suggest it." Walt reached across to the kitchen table. Dom reached back. They shook hands. Walt's mechanic grip wide and permanent grease that no amount of washing had ever fully resolved. Dom held it without flinching. "Then we have a deal," Walt said. Dom stood. At the kitchen doorway, he stopped and turned back. The question had been sitting in him for 11 days, and he had decided on the drive over that he was going to ask it. "When you opened that door," he said, "middle of the night, middle of a blizzard, 5 strangers. Were you afraid?" Walt thought about it honestly. "No," he said. "Not at all. They were just men standing in the cold." A brief pause. "I've been colder." Dom looked at him across the kitchen for a long moment. "Yes, sir," he said finally. "I believe you have." He walked out. The helicopter at the end of the lane began to spool up. Walt stayed at the table, both hands around his empty mug, Ruth's name in print on 4 separate pages spread in front of him. What was about to happen to Founders Lane would take 4 months to build, and about 40 years to fully understand. The construction crews arrived on a Monday morning in late April, and Founders Lane became for the first time in longer than most residents could accurately remember a street that someone was paying attention to. Scaffolding went up along the front of Walt's house within the first hour. By afternoon, the old roof was coming off in sections stripped back to the bare decking decades of patched shingles removed in pieces. Walt sat on Carla's porch across the lane with a cup of coffee and watched. Ruth's garden along the south fence had just begun coming up. The first green of the climbing roses was pushing through the mulch he had laid in March, right on schedule, as it always was. The new roof went on over 3 days. The furnace installation took 1 afternoon. A licensed technician ran the final check and switched the system on at 4 o'clock on a Thursday. Walt was standing in the hallway when the air came through the vents for the first time. He stood there with his eyes closed for 5 full minutes. Not moving, just feeling the heat come up through the floor and into the house, the way heat is supposed to come from something built correctly, doing the job it was designed to do. He went to the garage afterward. The crew had worked around it exactly as Dom had promised. Not a shelf moved, not a tool disturbed the oil stains on the concrete exactly where they had always been. Walt walked in, picked up a wrench from the bench, held it for a moment, set it back. "Still ours, Ruth," he said. 6 weeks later, the Ohio Housing Regulatory Board completed its audit of Frank Dillard's enforcement record, 26 months of documented activity, 41 compliance actions taken against properties on 3 specific streets in Mineral Ridge, 0 actions taken against comparable properties in newer residential developments on the city's north side during the same period. Dillard was suspended pending formal review. He filed his retirement paperwork 4 weeks into the suspension and was not replaced. Nobody on Founders Lane held a celebration. They simply noticed that the clipboard hadn't come around in a while. That was enough. The Walter and Ruth Hayes Auto and Trade Workshop opened on a Saturday morning in June. The old Mill Street warehouse had been transformed completely clean, sealed floors, professional lighting, on adjustable tracks, tool stations along both walls, 4 hydraulic lifts running down the center bay, a commercial parts washer, a welding station with proper ventilation, every piece of equipment functional, professional, real. The sign above the entrance was hand-painted at Walt's request. Simple block letters on a dark background. 15 young people from within 4 blocks showed up on opening day. They ranged from 16 to 24 and arrived with varying experience levels from none to some. Walt stood at the front workbench in his old canvas work shirt, the one with the grease on the left cuff that had never come fully out, and looked at them. "I'm going to teach you what my father taught me," he said. "What you do with it after that is between you and God." Deshaun was on a rolling stool in the front row, both elbows on the bench. He had his grandfather's eyes and his grandmother's patience, and no one had ever told him so. He would come to understand it eventually. The playground opened on the vacant lot at the end of the lane in July. The first children on the equipment were running within 20 minutes of the ribbon being cut. Their noise carried all the way to Walt's porch, that specific, uncomplicated joy that children produce when given actual space to exist freely. Carla organized a Saturday morning gathering. Within 3 weeks, it had become the thing the street did on Saturdays, and nobody had officially decided that. It just became true. The Veterans Memorial Wall went up at the corner of Founders Lane and Mill Street in late July. Gray granite, clean-cut edges, names carved in a font that was simple and would last. Walt stood in front of it after the installation crew left and ran his finger slowly along the rows of names, reading each one until he found the one he was looking for. Edward Big Eddie Reeves, Korea, 1951 to 1953. He stood there without moving for a long time. He didn't say anything. Some things don't need words. The scholarship ceremony at Mineral Ridge High School was held in September. 2 recipients. The first was Jasmine Cole, pre-med track straight A, average 3 years of weekly volunteering at the Mineral Ridge Food Pantry, the first person in her family to attend a 4-year university. The second name the principal read was Deshaun Hayes. Walt had not known Dom submitted Deshaun's application. Nobody had told him. He found out the moment the name was read from the podium. He walked up to present the awards. He looked at his prepared remarks at the podium, then set the paper aside. He looked out across the auditorium until he found his grandson's face in the 3rd row. He stood there for 4 full seconds without speaking. "Your grandmother," he said finally, would have screamed. The auditorium laughed. Then it went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when something genuinely true has been said in them. Then someone began clapping, and it did not stop for a long time. The bikers came back in October for the workshop's open house weekend, all 5 leather cuts on Harleys parked in a row along Founders Lane for the first time since February. Danny walked through the workshop door on his own 2 legs. Surgery had gone cleanly. 6 months behind him. He found Walt at the workbench and held on for a moment without saying anything. Walt let him. Hector brought his daughter the gap-toothed girl from the telephone photograph, now wearing a small leather jacket her father had commissioned. Walt crouched down and told her the jacket suited her perfectly. She told him very seriously that she already knew. Dom brought a framed photograph. Danny had taken it the morning after the blizzard on his phone, Walt's living room at 2 a.m, 5 bikers asleep on every available surface, an old man in his recliner keeping watch with the oil lamp burning yellow in the window behind him. Walt held the photograph for a long time without speaking. Dom launched the Open Door Initiative the following spring, annual Reeves Foundation grants supporting free community trade workshops across Ohio, Michigan, and Indiana. Named for one night on one dead-end street in Mineral Ridge. 1 year to the day, after the blizzard on a February evening, with a new storm moving in from the north, a man appeared at the far end of Founders Lane with 3 children in a car that had stopped running on the highway. He had walked nearly 2 miles in the cold. Walt got his jumper cables without being asked, drove out in the dark, got the engine started, and followed the family home to make sure the car held. The man stood on his porch before going inside and looked at Walt standing by his truck in the cold. "Why?" he said simply. "You didn't have to do any of this." Walt looked back at him. "Because somebody opened a door for me once," he said. "This is just what we do on this street." He got in his truck and drove home through the snow. Worth isn't measured by what you own. It's measured by what you do when it costs you something real. Walter Hayes had nothing by the world's accounting, no wealth, no platform, no name anyone recognized. But when 5 strangers stood cold on his doorstep, he gave everything he had without hesitation. That single quiet act rewrote the story of an entire street. That is the only currency that lasts. If this story moved you, drop your city and the time you're watching in the comments and subscribe, because these are the stories worth telling. There are more where this came from, and every single one of them is real.